A child, no older than 7, wanders alone down a forgotten stretch of Wyoming backroad, dust-covered, sun-drenched, and miles from the nearest home. His name is Joshua, and he is lost. There's no sign of cars, no footprints, no trail to follow. Just endless open land, the kind that seems to swallow sound and scatter hope to the wind. He had been chasing a jackrabbit, giggling, thinking he was on a harmless little adventure, while his grandmother cooked supper back at the ranch. But the jackrabbit darted through a gap in the fence, and Joshua, driven by the thrill of the chase, followed, further and further, until the fences disappeared, the familiar hills faded behind him, and the wild took over. Now the light is shifting, the sky melting from afternoon blue to a burnt orange haze, and the warmth of the sun is being replaced by the chill of evening air. His knees are scraped raw, his palms caked with dirt from when he tripped on a twisted root just minutes ago. His little chest rises and falls with shallow, panicked breaths. "Grandma?" he calls out, voice trembling, breaking under the weight of fear. There's no answer. The only sound is the wind brushing through the tall grass, rustling the dry sagebrush, and whispering secrets Joshua doesn't want to hear. He turns in a slow circle, eyes darting across the open land, trying to pick out something familiar, a tree, a trail, a fence post, anything that might lead him back. But the vastness is overwhelming. It all looks the same, wide, empty, endless. The road beneath his feet is cracked and narrow, forgotten by all but time itself. It stretches like a ghost in both directions, with no promise of salvation on either end. Joshua wipes his face with the sleeve of his already torn shirt, smearing tears across dirt-smudged cheeks. His stomach growls, his hands shake. "Grandma, please," he tries again, quieter this time, as though he's forgotten how to be loud. He's too young to know what real danger is, but his instincts are beginning to understand what his mind cannot. He shouldn't be here, and he's not safe. He moves to the side of the road and sinks down onto the packed dirt, tucking his knees into his chest. A shiver rolls through him as the wind picks up, a low, whistling reminder that night is approaching fast, and with it cold and darkness and who knows what else. Coyotes, snakes. His imagination, fueled by every bedtime story that ever ended in danger, begins to run wild. Every shadow seems to twitch. Every rustle in the grass makes him flinch. He's trying not to cry again, but the fear is too big. It spills over. His shoulders shake as silent sobs rise in his throat. "I just want to go home," he whispers into the fading light. And that's when it happens. The earth beneath him gives the faintest shudder, subtle at first, so soft it might be his imagination. But then it grows, a dull, rhythmic vibration, a low thrum that rolls through the ground and up into his bones. He sits up, eyes wide, holding his breath. The air changes, charged with something he can't name, something that feels older than him, older than anything he's ever known. The sound comes next, hoofbeats, not one, many, distant but coming closer, the rhythmic thunder of powerful legs pounding the earth, steady, unstoppable, horses, but not the kind you see in pastures or behind fences. These are wild, unbroken, born of the open plains and the harsh mountain wind, and they're coming straight for him. He scrambles to his feet, unsure whether to run or hide or simply vanish, but there's nowhere to go, nowhere to run. The road is empty, the grass too tall to see through. His heart hammers in his chest. The sound of the approaching herd grows louder. He clenches his fists, bracing for he doesn't even know what. And then, like ghosts emerging from the golden light, they appear. A dozen at first, then more. Muscles rippling beneath gleaming coats, manes tangled by the wind, eyes sharp, alert, almost human in their awareness. The leader is unmistakable, a massive black stallion with a white star blazing in the center of his forehead. He doesn't charge, he doesn't stop. He walks, and the others follow. They surround the boy, not in chaos, not in threat, but with something else. And in that moment, the wilderness holds its breath, because what happens next defies everything anyone thought they knew about wild horses, lost children, and the invisible threads that connect us all. The ground pulsed beneath his bare feet, the drumbeat of hooves growing louder, more defined, more real. Joshua stood frozen in the middle of the old dirt road, breath caught in his throat, eyes wide and locked on the ridge ahead. The wind carried dust and whispers, and in the dying light, shadows began to move. First, they were just silhouettes, shifting, graceful shapes emerging from the amber haze where land met sky. But then came the sound again, clearer now, the unmistakable thunder of a herd in motion. Dozens of hooves striking dry earth in perfect rhythm, a wild and ancient music echoing across the valley. And then they broke through. A herd of wild Mustangs emerging from the hill like a living tide. Their coats gleamed in the low sun, shades of chestnut, gray, sorrel, and black. Their manes, caught in the wind, streamed like banners of defiance. Dust swirled around their legs as they moved, not in panic, but in unison, with a calm intensity that suggested purpose. Not a stampede, not confusion, something deliberate, something chosen. At their head was the black stallion, the same one Joshua would one day call Star, his presence undeniable. Broad-shouldered and commanding, his hooves barely seemed to touch the ground as he led the charge, his white-starred forehead glowing in the twilight like a mark of destiny. Joshua stumbled backward, overwhelmed by their sheer size, their power, their numbers. He didn't scream. He didn't run. It was like his body already knew something his mind hadn't caught up to yet, that these horses weren't here to hurt him, that this was something else. The lead stallion slowed. The herd followed, as if responding to some silent signal. In a matter of seconds, the open road transformed. One by one, the horses began to encircle him, a calculated formation. Not too close, not too far. Just enough to place the boy at the very center of their quiet storm. The stallion moved to the front, only a few feet away now, his breath visible in the cooling air. He stood still, his eyes locked onto Joshua's, unblinking, intelligent, watchful. The boy's heart pounded, his mouth dry, but his fear began to melt, replaced by something stranger, a feeling of being seen fully and completely, not just as a child, not just as a human, but as something worthy of their attention. He could hear their breathing now, slow and deep. He could smell the sun-warmed sweat on their hides, the dry grass tangled in their tails, the wildness that clung to them like smoke from a forgotten fire. None of them moved to touch him. None reared or whinnied or bucked in panic. They simply stood, unmoving, creating a barrier between him and the rest of the world. It made no sense. Everything Joshua had been told about wild horses said they avoided people, especially children. They spooked easily, kept their distance, vanished before a footstep ever got close. But not these. These horses didn't just accept his presence. They chose it. They gathered around him with intention, as if they'd come for him, found him, surrounded him to keep him safe. The black stallion took a step closer. Joshua flinched instinctively, unsure of what was coming next. But the stallion didn't strike. He didn't bite or rear or call the others to attack. Instead, he dropped his massive head slowly and exhaled, warm air brushing across the boy's face. A moment later, his soft muzzle gently touched Joshua's shoulder, almost like a nudge of reassurance, a gesture that said, "You're not alone anymore." Joshua blinked, a tear escaping down his cheek. He whispered, "Are you here to help me?" The stallion didn't respond in any way a person would, but he didn't walk away either. He stayed right there, his body angled slightly, as if shielding the child from the wind, now picking up again. A mare, dappled gray with eyes the color of storm clouds, stepped forward next, lowering her head just as the stallion had done. She didn't touch him, only stared, then moved to stand beside her leader, flanking the child with quiet solidarity. More horses shifted into new positions, repositioning their bodies until it became impossible to mistake what was happening. This was not coincidence, not idle curiosity. The formation was clear. They were guarding him. And the strangest part of all, Joshua began to feel calm. The crying had stopped. The panic that had once gripped his chest like a vice now loosened. The cold seemed to pull back. Even the growing darkness didn't feel so scary anymore. Something about their presence wrapped around him like a blanket. He no longer looked over his shoulder. He didn't need to. They were watching the horizon, watching the hills, watching for him. He whispered into the wind, "You found me. But why?" The wind didn't answer, but the herd didn't leave. And in that silence, as the twilight deepened and stars began to peek through the sky, a boy and a herd of wild Mustangs stood together, each changed by the other in ways they didn't yet understand. A bond had formed in that circle of dust and breath and shared stillness, a promise, unspoken, but as real as the ground beneath their feet. Something had brought these horses to this moment, something that reached far beyond instinct, far beyond logic, far beyond anything Joshua or anyone else could explain. There was a weight in the stillness now, not heavy with fear, but with something older and more mysterious. Joshua stood silently inside the ring of Mustangs, his small frame dwarfed by the powerful creatures that surrounded him. Each horse held its place without command, their positions deliberate, as if guided by a law only they understood. The black stallion, the one who had touched Joshua's shoulder, remained just a breath away, his presence like a mountain in the dusk, solid and unmoving. The others shifted now and then, hooves rustling against dry earth, tails swishing at flies, but no one broke the formation. It wasn't random, it wasn't chaos, it was a circle, protective, precise, as if they'd done this before. Joshua glanced at each of them in turn. Their eyes were not the vacant kind he expected from animals. Number. These eyes were sharp, observant, each pair watching him the way a sentry would watch a gate. They weren't just standing there. They were guarding him. Every time he moved, the black stallion's ears twitched, subtly reacting. When Joshua turned toward the mare on his left, she shifted her weight, bringing herself slightly forward, closer to him. They were responding to him, reacting, adjusting their stance with every breath he took. He could feel it now, not just their warmth, but their attention. It wrapped around him like an invisible force, one he hadn't known he'd needed. The fear that had sat so heavily on his chest only moments ago had vanished entirely. In its place was something different, something that, even at 7 years old, he recognized deep in his bones. Safety. They were strangers, wild and wordless, and yet he felt more protected here than he had ever felt behind a locked door. The road, once endless and terrifying, had faded behind a wall of muscle and mane. He could no longer see where he had come from, nor where it led, but somehow it didn't matter. These horses had claimed the space around him, not just physically, but spiritually, and it was in that strange, sacred space that something within him began to shift. His breathing slowed, his fists unclenched. He stopped looking for danger and started to feel present. A sudden gust of wind stirred the tall grass, sending ripples across the field like waves on water. The Mustangs didn't flinch. They stood firm, their silhouettes glowing against the last light of the sky. Joshua tilted his head upward. The stars were beginning to show, tiny diamonds scattered across velvet. The first real darkness was arriving, but it didn't scare him anymore. Not while he was here, not while they were here. The air grew cooler, but even that seemed distant, the chill unable to reach him through the invisible shield the herd had created. The black stallion exhaled again, a deep, resonant breath that seemed to echo around the circle. Joshua met his gaze. There was something in those eyes, not pity, not curiosity, something closer to recognition, as if the stallion knew exactly what the boy was feeling because maybe he had once felt it too. Alone, afraid, surrounded by a world too big, too strange, and yet he'd survived it. More than that, he'd grown into a leader, a protector, the protector. Joshua took a tentative step forward, just one. Immediately, the horses closest to him adjusted. The mare to his left stepped with him. A bay gelding on his right tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing as if calculating where Joshua might move next. There was no panic, no sudden burst of motion, only trust, as if they were giving him permission to move freely inside their circle, like a guest in a place few had ever entered. His boots crunched on the gravel. He looked around, suddenly aware that not even the animals of the field dared come close. No crickets chirped, no birds called. The world was watching this moment from a distance. He whispered, "Are you going to take me home?" He didn't expect an answer, but the black stallion responded, not with words, but with a slow, deliberate turn of his head, looking back toward the direction from which the herd had come. Then, as if deciding something final, he gave a short, sharp snort and took a step away from the circle. The rest of the herd responded instantly, their formation breaking and shifting. Some moved to the edges of the road, some waited behind. And in the center, the black stallion remained, glancing back at Joshua one more time. The boy looked around. The circle had opened. A path now existed between the horses, leading toward the shadowed hills beyond. He didn't know what lay that way, but he knew, without question, that the stallion wanted him to follow. Joshua hesitated. Then he took one more step. The stallion moved, the others followed, and just like that, the most improbable thing happened. The boy began to walk, guided down the darkening road by a herd of wild Mustangs. The same horses most would call dangerous, unpredictable, untrustworthy, but not this time, not this night. They were calm, controlled, a walking formation that surrounded him not as captors, but as guardians. The stallion stayed to his side now, like a shadow with heartbeat and breath. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Joshua wondered if he was dreaming, if maybe he'd fallen and hit his head and this was all part of some strange, wonderful fantasy. But then he stumbled slightly, catching his foot on a loose stone, and the pain in his scraped knee reminded him this was real. All of it. The horses, the silence, the safety, the impossible. And deep down, he knew something else was true too. This wasn't the first time the Mustangs had seen him. It wasn't chance that brought them to that road. They had been watching, waiting, maybe even protecting him before he ever got lost. They knew him, just like he was beginning to know them. And something about that was more comforting than any warm blanket or nightlight ever could be, because this was real, and whatever happened next, he wasn't alone anymore. The engine growled low beneath the battered hood of the old pickup, its headlights cutting a yellow path through the gathering dusk. Thomas Redwater squinted through the dusty windshield, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel with practiced steadiness. His eyes were sharp, despite his 72 years, but there was something in the distance, just up ahead on the long stretch of road, hugging the curve of the valley. That made him slow down. At first, he thought it was a trick of the failing light, maybe a mirage. The Wyoming landscape had a way of playing games with tired minds, especially after a long day and a longer life lived mostly in solitude. But the shape didn't flicker or fade. It held, and the closer he got, the clearer it became. Horses, a whole herd of them, standing still on the road like statues carved from dusk and dust. Thomas eased off the gas, the truck rolling to a crawl. His breath caught when he saw what they surrounded. A child, small, motionless, right in the center of the herd, not running, not struggling, just there. The horses, wild Mustangs by the look of them, weren't scattered in chaos or alarm like they should have been. They were gathered around the boy in a perfect circle, their heads low, their bodies poised but calm. It was unnatural, wrong, and yet it wasn't. It was strange and beautiful and impossible all at once. He pulled the truck to the side of the road and killed the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. The headlights cast long shadows, and the Mustangs shifted only slightly under the glow, as if acknowledging his presence but refusing to retreat. That alone made Thomas's stomach twist. He had worked with horses all his life, trained them, respected them, knew them in a way most never would. And wild horses didn't behave like this. They didn't linger near roads. They didn't approach people. And they sure as hell didn't stand guard over children. He stepped out slowly, the creak of the truck door splitting the silence. He didn't move closer. Not yet. Just stood there, watching, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The boy's face was streaked with dirt, and there were dried tears on his cheeks. His jeans were ripped, his hands scraped, but he was standing. Safe. No visible injuries, no panic in his eyes, only awe. He was watching the stallion beside him with a quiet sort of trust that unsettled Thomas more than the entire scene itself. The stallion was unlike anything Thomas had seen in years. Solid black, powerful, with a star-shaped patch of white on his forehead that glowed in the truck's headlights like it had been painted there by fate itself. Recognition hit Thomas like a blow to the chest. That marking, that horse, it couldn't be, not after all these years. But there he was, Star. Thomas hadn't spoken that name aloud in over 2 decades, not since the day he let the young foal go, wounded and orphaned, back into the wild, praying he'd make it, knowing the odds were slim. He remembered every detail, how the foal had limped into his property, barely alive after a brutal BLM roundup gone wrong, how he had stitched him up by lantern light, fed him, earned his trust in silence, day after day, and then, when the time came, set him free. He had told himself that was the end, that wild things deserved their freedom, even if they took a piece of you with them when they left. But now, here he was, grown, strong, leader of a herd, and standing protectively over a boy like he understood what he was doing. Thomas stepped forward slowly, his boots crunching on gravel. The stallion's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Neither did the boy. Thomas spoke gently, the words unfamiliar on his tongue after years of silence. "Hey there, son. You all right?" The boy looked up. His eyes were wide, tired but steady. "I got lost," he said, his voice small but clear. "I was trying to find my grandma's ranch, but I couldn't." Thomas took another step forward, stopping just at the edge of the herd's invisible barrier. "What's your name?" "Joshua. Joshua Blackwood." The name hit him like a spark catching dry brush. Margaret Blackwood's grandson. That explained a lot, and nothing all at once. The Blackwood Ranch bordered public lands, some of the few remaining acres where wild Mustangs could still roam free. Margaret had always stood up for the horses, even when most ranchers wanted them gone. Thomas hadn't spoken to her in years, not since before the fire at Eagle Ridge, but he remembered her as a woman of grit and loyalty. "I know your grandma," he said softly. "She'll be worried sick about you." Joshua nodded, blinking hard. "I was scared, but then they came." He looked around at the Mustangs like he was still trying to believe they were real. They didn't leave. They stayed. They made a circle. Thomas swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "They protected you." "Yes." The boy's voice quivered. "That one," he pointed to Star. "He was the first. He came right to me. I thought he might run me over, but he just stood there." Thomas took a slow breath and stepped forward again. The stallion watched him, head tilted, ears flicked forward. Thomas extended a hand, palm up. "You remember me, don't you?" Star didn't move at first. Then, inch by inch, he lowered his head and pressed his muzzle into Thomas's hand. It wasn't fear, it wasn't dominance, it was something else. Recognition, trust, a memory held in muscle and scent, and something deeper that humans had long forgotten how to name. The boy smiled. "He knows you." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed. "Yeah," he said finally. "We have history." He looked back toward the truck. "Come on, Joshua, let's get you home. Your grandma's waiting." "But the horses," Joshua's voice cracked with worry. "Will they be okay?" Thomas glanced back at the herd, his eyes lingering on Star. "They'll be fine. They're survivors." As he helped Joshua into the truck, something stirred behind them. The Mustangs began to move, not away, but with them. Slowly, quietly, they began to follow. A procession of muscle and breath and spirit moving through the twilight like a shadowed dream. Star walked closest, never once taking his eyes off the boy. Joshua pressed his face against the passenger window, staring in awe. "They're following us." Thomas stared straight ahead, hands gripping the wheel like it was the only solid thing in the world. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that's not normal." And deep in his gut, he knew this was only the beginning. By the time they reached the edge of the Blackwood Ranch, the last of the light had faded from the Wyoming sky. Stars stretched across the heavens in glittering silence, vast and eternal, but all Thomas could focus on were the lights scattered around the homestead. Flashlights danced across the fields. Headlamps cast long beams through fences and trees. Figures moved in hurried, desperate patterns. Neighbors, ranch hands, law enforcement, all searching, all hoping. At the gate stood Margaret Blackwood, still and silent in the chaos, her weathered hands clenched around the straps of her worn jacket, her gaze locked onto the empty horizon. She didn't speak, she didn't cry, she just stood, her spine straight, her expression strained with a kind of fear only a parent or a grandparent can understand. Then the headlights of Thomas's truck pierced the dark. She didn't react at first, not until the engine cut off and the driver's door swung open. She took one step forward, then another, and when the passenger door opened and a small boy leapt down from the seat, her voice finally broke through the night. "Joshua!" The boy turned toward her with a cry of relief and ran, his small legs kicking up dirt and dust as he sprinted toward the only home he'd ever known. Margaret caught him in her arms, pulling him against her chest with a gasp. Her hands trembled as she ran them through his hair, over his back, as if to convince herself he was real, whole, breathing. She didn't speak at first, just held him, her heart beating so loud he could probably hear it. "I'm okay, Grandma," Joshua whispered into her coat. "I'm really okay." Only then did her voice return, rough and uneven. "When you didn't come back for supper, I thought—" But she couldn't finish. The words crumbled under the weight of all that could have gone wrong. Behind them, the searchers began to lower their flashlights and radios. Sheriff James Holden stepped forward, his expression a mix of relief and curiosity. Tall, lean, and lined with years of duty, he carried the authority of someone who had seen too much, worn it like armor, and still kept showing up. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said gently, "we should have the boy checked out, just to be safe." Margaret nodded, her hand still resting protectively on Joshua's back. Of course. It was only then that she looked past the sheriff toward the man leaning against the hood of the old pickup. Thomas Redwater. The name hung in the air like dust in a sunbeam. People turned, surprised, curious. Thomas didn't move. "It's been a long time," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying something like disbelief and something else, gratitude. Thomas gave her a short nod, all he could manage under the weight of her gaze. "Found him out by Ridge Road, about 5 miles east." Holden frowned, his brow creasing beneath the brim of his hat. "We had teams searching that area not an hour ago. Didn't see a trace of him." Thomas didn't respond. He didn't need to. Joshua was standing right there, safe. As the group began to shift and reorient, Dr. Sarah Mitchell appeared, her calm, practiced presence settling the moment. A ranch vet with more experience than she ever let on, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew how to save lives without making a fuss. "Hey there, young man," she said with a smile as she knelt before Joshua. "Mind if I check you out?" Joshua nodded, but his eyes stayed on Thomas, who had started to back away toward the truck. "Mr. Thomas," Joshua called out, "wait, you didn't tell them about Star." Thomas paused mid-step. The name, spoken so loudly, so innocently, made more than one head turn. "Star?" Sheriff Holden echoed. "The horse?" Joshua nodded eagerly. "The black one with the white star on his head. He protected me. Mr. Thomas knows him." All eyes turned to Thomas now, and for a moment he considered saying nothing at all. But that moment passed, and he found himself stepping back toward the group, his voice low but firm. "I know the stallion, or I did, a long time ago." Margaret's gaze sharpened, something dawning in her expression. "You helped a foal, didn't you? Years ago, after that BLM roundup?" Thomas nodded. "Left him with a wound across his leg and no mother to guide him. I patched him up at the cabin. When he was strong enough, I let him go." "You think it's the same horse?" Holden asked, still skeptical. "I don't think," Thomas replied. "I know. He remembered me tonight. Let me touch him." The silence that followed was full of shifting thoughts. For lawmen and ranchers used to black and white facts, this was something different, something that didn't fit neatly into any report. "You saying a wild stallion protected this boy?" Holden asked slowly. "Stood guard over him like, what? A dog?" "Not just stood," Thomas said. "Led. The whole herd formed a circle around him. I've never seen anything like it." "And they followed us home," Joshua added brightly, his face lighting up again. "All the way to the ranch." Thomas looked at him. They kept their distance, close but not too close, watching. Dr. Mitchell stood, her brows furrowed. "That's remarkable. Wild Mustangs are skittish at best, especially around vehicles, humans, noise. To follow a truck, especially with a child inside, that's not normal." "No," Thomas agreed. "It's not." Holden scratched his chin. "If this is true, we'll need to file a statement. Document the behavior. There might be some kind of, I don't know, protective instinct at work. Or maybe they sensed the boy was vulnerable." Thomas looked toward the open land beyond the ranch. The hills rolled into the distance, dusky and untouched. Somewhere out there, Starr and his herd were still moving, still watching. "It's more than instinct," he said softly. "It was deliberate. It was purposeful." Margaret's hand slid into her grandson's. "He's safe. That's all that matters." But even as she spoke the words, Thomas could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She too understood what this meant, that something extraordinary had happened here, that this wasn't just a child returning home, it was the start of something bigger. He stepped back again, retreating toward his truck, but before he could climb in, Joshua called out once more. "Will you come visit, Mr. Thomas? I want to hear more about Starr and the other horses." Thomas hesitated. The weight of 20 years of solitude pressed against his chest. He had worked hard to keep the world at arm's length, but tonight, the world had come to him. "We'll see," he said gruffly, and got in the truck. As the engine started and the headlights swept across the ranch one last time, no one noticed the dark shapes gathered just beyond the fence line. Mustangs, watching, waiting, and at the front of them all stood the stallion with the white star on his forehead, his eyes reflecting the light like mirrors of something ancient. He didn't move, not yet, but his presence lingered like a promise, and the valley, silent and shadowed, held its breath. The next morning, Wind River Valley woke slowly beneath a pale golden sky, the kind that promised warmth but carried a lingering chill in the shadows. At the Blackwood Ranch, the usual morning sounds, lowing cattle, creaking fences, the distant rustle of wind through the sage, were overlaid with something else, something heavier. News traveled fast in Pinecrest, faster than any official report. By sunrise, nearly everyone in the valley had heard some version of the story. A young boy lost in the wilderness, a herd of wild mustangs forming a protective circle around him, and a reclusive veteran who hadn't been seen in town for years, returning with the child, safe in his truck. The details shifted with every retelling. Some said the horses talked, others claimed the boy had ridden on the back of a black stallion with a glowing white mark. But one thing remained constant. The Mustangs had protected him, and that fact alone had already set off a storm no one had expected. Thomas Redwater sat alone on his porch, a half-empty mug of black coffee growing cold in his weathered hand. He hadn't slept much, Not for any reason he could explain outright. There were no nightmares, no memories clawing their way to the surface, not like before, just thoughts, too many of them. He kept seeing the stallion's eyes in his mind, that calm, unwavering stare, the way he had moved around the boy, not with fear, not with confusion, but with purpose. And then, later, the way the herd had followed his truck all the way back to the Blackwood gate, as if they knew exactly where they were going, as if they were escorting the boy home. He leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the land beyond his property. The pasture was quiet now. No sign of the herd, not even the faintest echo of hoofbeats. But something had changed. The stillness felt temporary, like a held breath. Something was coming, and Thomas could feel it in his bones. The crunch of tires on gravel broke his thoughts. He turned to see an unfamiliar car pulling into the drive, sleek, black, expensive. Definitely not local. He stood slowly, setting the mug aside as the door opened and a man stepped out, tailored suit, silver-streaked hair, polished shoes already gathering dust. Everything about him screamed city, the kind of city that didn't understand land, or weather, or horses, except as marketing slogans. "Mr. Redwater," the man called out, his smile tight, calculated. "Victor Harrington, a pleasure." Thomas said nothing, just studied him with the flat, unreadable gaze that had sent better men packing. Harrington didn't flinch. "I believe you're acquainted with Margaret Blackwood. Lovely woman, strong, stubborn." Still, Thomas said nothing. "I'm working with the county," Harrington continued smoothly. "We're developing a new eco-resort just east of here. It's going to bring jobs, tourism, stability to this valley. I imagine you've heard something about it." "I've heard." Thomas's voice was low, gravel-worn. "I've also heard you've been trying to buy out the ranchers." "Buy out?" Harrington chuckled. "That's such a harsh way to put it. I make offers, very generous ones. Most people see the sense in letting go of worn-out land and trading it for a better future." Thomas's jaw tensed. "This land isn't worn out. It's alive, and it doesn't need your future." Harrington's smile didn't falter, but his eyes cooled. "We're expanding infrastructure, which means acquiring access rights. Water, grazing corridors. That stream running through your property? It crosses into land I've just purchased. I've already applied for control of the water rights." "You'd cut off a man's water to force his hand?" Thomas asked, not angry, yet just measuring. "I'd call it good business." Harrington adjusted his cufflink. "We all make sacrifices for progress, Mr. Redwater. You're an intelligent man. I'm offering you the chance to be part of the future." "I'm not interested in your future," Thomas said, stepping forward now, voice hardening. "And neither is that herd." Harrington's expression darkened, the veneer slipping for just a moment. "You really think a few horses matter? That protecting some old Mustangs means anything to the state or the BLM?" "They matter to that boy," Thomas said, flat and final. "And they matter to me." Harrington's smile returned, but it was thinner now, brittle at the edges. "Then I suppose we're on opposite sides of this, Mr. Redwater. But let me be clear. This valley is changing, with or without your permission." He turned and climbed back into his car. The engine hummed to life, quiet and expensive, and in seconds he was gone, trailing a wake of dust down the road. Thomas watched until the car disappeared over the rise. Only then did he exhale. And when he did, it came out cold. That evening, Margaret arrived at his door. "I need your help," she said simply, "and so do the horses." They sat together on his porch, an echo of decades past, two people carved out of the same Wyoming clay, weathered by time, hardened by loss. She told him what the sheriff had said, about the BLM's plans to round up the herd within the month, about how Harrington was pushing for expedited action, about the pressure from the bank, about the rumors spreading like wildfire, rumors of a stallion protecting a child, of a bond no one could explain. "He wants the ranch, Thomas," she said. He wants the land and the water, but most of all I think he wants the Mustangs gone." Thomas nodded slowly. "Because they stand in the way." "They always have," she said. "Free things tend to." They sat in silence for a while, the wind picking up across the field, bending the dry grasses like whispers across a grave. Finally, Thomas spoke. "He remembers me, that stallion, Star. He knows who I am." Margaret didn't look surprised. "And Joshua," she said. "He says they've been watching him for months, standing at the fence line. The black one comes closest." Thomas's voice dropped. "He came to me too, not just to Joshua." Margaret turned to face him fully. "Then maybe he's waiting." "For what?" "For someone to fight." Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked out at the land that had once saved him, at the barns he'd let fall into ruin, at the fences he hadn't mended, at the valley he had tried so hard to leave alone. "I don't know if I have that in me anymore." Margaret's voice was soft but firm. "You do, or you wouldn't have brought my grandson home." She stood and laid a hand on his shoulder. "We can't do this without you." She didn't wait for his answer, just walked down the steps, back toward her truck, leaving Thomas alone in the growing dark, surrounded by wind, silence, and the weight of choice. He stood there long after she'd gone, watching the sky shift from gold to indigo, the stars blinking into existence one by one, like old memories returning uninvited. And somewhere out in the hills, unseen but not forgotten, the Mustangs were moving, waiting, holding the line between wild and tame, between past and future, between what had been and what was still possible. And Thomas Redwater, a man who had spent 20 years turning his back on the world, found himself staring into the night, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he had one more fight left in him. By the time the next day's sun began stretching pale light across the high plains, word of the Mustang's strange behavior had spread beyond Pinecrest's borders. Stories were leaking into neighboring towns, whispered in diners and hardware stores, picked up by local radio chatter and fringe blogs hungry for any tale of mystery and wonder in a world too used to the ordinary. People were calling it a miracle. Some said the stallion was a spirit guardian. Others claimed the boy had a gift. But underneath all the awe and fascination was something more powerful: unease, the kind that comes when the natural order stirs, when something wild defies the rules and forces people to question what they thought they knew. And at the center of it all was Joshua Blackwood, 7 years old, with dirt still in the lines of his hands and a quiet certainty in his voice that didn't belong to someone his age. That morning, Thomas stood at the edge of his property, boots crunching over frost-hardened dirt, watching the wind roll down from the mesa like a ghost. His breath misted in the cold air, and for a long while he didn't move. Something inside him had shifted. He could feel it, like a spring pulled too tight, waiting to snap. The conversation with Margaret still echoed in his head, as did the image of that black sedan pulling away in a cloud of dust. Harrington hadn't come back, not yet, but his presence lingered like the aftertaste of something sour. Behind Thomas, the old barn stood silhouetted against the dawn. Once a sanctuary, it had become little more than a monument to past failures. But even now, even in its state of disrepair, it called to him. The land around it, too, seemed different, more alert, as if it was watching, listening, waiting for something to begin again. By mid-morning, Joshua arrived with Margaret, bounding from the truck with an energy only children seemed to possess. But it wasn't just excitement that lit up his face. It was focus, purpose, the kind adults often forget they once had. "I brought him some oats," Joshua said, holding up a small burlap bag like a peace offering. "Star might be hungry." Thomas gave a skeptical glance at the offering but nodded. Horses don't usually take food from people they don't trust. Joshua didn't miss a beat. "He trusts me. He already told me." And with that simple sentence, Thomas was reminded again that this wasn't about horses. Not really. This was about something deeper. A connection, a message, a reckoning. They walked together toward the fence line on the east side of the Blackwood property, the place where Joshua had last seen the Mustangs gathering. The boy moved with an instinct that Thomas couldn't ignore. He wasn't looking for tracks or signs, he just walked, like he already knew where they'd be. Sure enough, as they reached the ridge overlooking the lower pasture, Thomas spotted the familiar dark shape of Star, standing still as a statue near the boundary. A dozen other Mustangs lingered in the distance, grazing, pacing, restless, but Star was still, watching. Joshua stopped a few paces from the fence. "He's waiting for you." Thomas hesitated, then stepped forward. He kept his movements slow, unthreatening. The stallion didn't back away. Instead, his ears flicked forward, and he let out a low breath, the sound sharp in the cold air. "You remember," Thomas muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the animal. "You really do." From behind them, Margaret stood silent, arms crossed, face unreadable. This was the moment she had hoped for, but seeing it unfold made her heart ache in ways she hadn't expected. She saw the weight of it all pressing down on Thomas's shoulders, the ghosts he still carried, the burden he never asked to pick up again. And she saw the way Joshua looked at the stallion, with awe but also with understanding, as if he'd been born for this exact moment. Later that afternoon, back at the ranch house, the three of them sat around the kitchen table. Joshua, sipping from a mug of cocoa, swung his legs restlessly beneath the chair. Thomas sat with his hands clasped, elbows on the table, while Margaret spread a stack of paperwork between them. Printouts, clippings, hand-scrawled notes, a folder labeled Conservation Appeal. "I've been digging," she said, voice low, "and Jack Reeves got someone in Cheyenne to pull old BLM files. That herd, Star's herd, was flagged for DNA testing years ago. Never followed through. Bureau shelved the results. Budget cuts." Thomas frowned. "You think they're Spanish?" "Could be," she replied. "And if they are, that changes everything. There's precedent for protecting genetically unique wild horse populations. Delays gathers, forces federal reviews." "We'd need proof," Thomas said, "and not just DNA. We need behavior logs, witnesses, photos, expert testimony. Hell, a miracle wouldn't hurt." "We've already got one," Margaret said, nodding toward Joshua. "You just haven't accepted it yet." That night, as wind howled across the valley and cold crept in through every crack and gap in the old ranch house, Thomas lay awake on the small cot he'd taken up in the guest room. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind replayed every moment of the last few days, every glance from Star, every word from Harrington, every time Joshua had said something that felt like truth. Something was coming, something that would test them all. Thomas could feel it, and somewhere, far out on the range, Star stood beneath the moonlight, surrounded by his herd, ears twitching to the wind, watching, waiting. The wild was not done yet. The next morning, the Blackwood Ranch felt different, not just in the way the frost clung a little longer to the ground, or how the horses in the paddocks were more restless than usual, but in the air itself. It was thick with tension, the kind that comes before a storm, even when the skies are clear. The quiet was heavy, as though the valley was holding its breath. Inside the house, Margaret stood at the window, watching the horizon as if expecting the land to speak. Joshua sat at the kitchen table, uncharacteristically still, drawing something with his finger in the condensation on his glass of milk. Thomas had returned at sunrise after checking the eastern boundary. He hadn't said much when he came in, just took off his jacket, poured himself a coffee, and sat down with a look that said everything. "They're closer today," he finally muttered, eyes distant. "The herd. They've moved down near the stone bluff. That's less than a mile from the south road." Margaret nodded, her arms crossed, face tight with worry. "It's like they know." "They do know," Joshua said quietly, not looking up. "Star told them to stay near. He's trying to keep them safe." Thomas rubbed a hand over his face. He wanted to deny it, to explain away the boy's strange intuition, but he couldn't. Not after what he'd seen. Not after the way the stallion had moved with intent, with awareness. It was undeniable now. Something far beyond instinct was guiding that herd. Something deeper. Before anyone could respond, the sound of a vehicle climbing the ranch road cut through the morning quiet. Gravel crunched under heavy tires, and a cloud of dust trailed the approach. A few moments later, the familiar rumble of Jack Reeves's motorcycle followed. Then another truck, older, rust-spotted, but with purpose. They were gathering. The cavalry, as Margaret had called them days earlier, had returned. Out front, Jack swung off his bike and walked toward the porch with that loose, confident stride that always made people underestimate him. But not today. Today, he looked every bit the war-hardened biker with a cause. "Got news," he said as Thomas met him on the steps. "Sheriff called. The BLM filed an amendment this morning. They've officially moved up the gather date. Said it's due to herd migration patterns and environmental strain. Total garbage. This is Harrington pushing for speed. He wants the land cleared now, before the press gets too deep into the story." Margaret joined them, her face darkening. "They're trying to rush it through before the DNA tests come back." Jack nodded grimly. "And before the petition can be processed. They're hoping, if they act fast, nobody'll raise a big enough stink in time to stop it." Inside, Joshua had come to the doorway, listening silently. Thomas's voice was calm, but the edge was unmistakable. "How long?" 3 days, Jack said, maybe less. They've already started staging equipment near the county line. Helicopters, temporary corrals, trailers. It's all moving fast. Margaret exhaled hard through her nose. "So that's it? They just sweep in and take them?" "Unless we do something," Jack replied, "something loud." Thomas looked toward the horizon, the ridgelines, the open sky, the lands he knew like the lines on his own hands. "We can't stop the BLM with just noise," he said. "They'll need more than protests and outrage." Jack cracked a grin. "Good, because we've got more." Over the next few hours, the house became a hub of quiet, purposeful movement. Jack's brothers from the frontier outlaws arrived one by one, bringing more than just tools this time. Generators, radios, portable fencing, heavy canvas tops, gear that could turn a rundown sanctuary into a defensive perimeter, or at the very least, a line in the dirt that dared the government to cross it. Riley, the local reporter, returned with a satchel full of printed interviews, emails from university contacts, and photos, dozens of them, showing Starr and his herd, up close, calm, interacting in ways that no wild animals should. Each image backed Joshua's story, each one chipped away at disbelief. Meanwhile, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the local veterinarian and longtime advocate for wildlife conservation, set up a small lab space in Margaret's utility room. She was already prepping sample kits, finishing DNA paperwork, and fielding calls from conservationists who were catching wind of the story. "This isn't just a herd of horses anymore," she told Thomas as she clipped documents into a binder. "It's a symbol, a test case. If the government pushes forward despite the evidence, this could blow up in their face." Joshua wandered from room to room, quiet but always near. Whenever the adults grew tense, his small voice would cut through the noise with calm observations, simple, direct, always about the horses, about Starr, about what was coming. None of it came across as fear. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. And then, just before sunset, something happened. Thomas, out checking the ridge where he'd first seen the herd days before, heard a sound that stopped him cold. A deep, rhythmic pounding. Hooves. Not just one horse. Dozens. He turned slowly and watched as the Mustangs crested the hill in formation. Starr led them, majestic, dark as twilight, that white star on his forehead like a brand from another world. The herd didn't flee at the sight of him. They didn't veer or hesitate. They came directly to the line of fence bordering the eastern pasture of the Blackwood Ranch and stopped, standing still as stones, facing the property like soldiers at attention. Thomas stood alone in the field, hands loose at his sides, staring in wonder. They'd come again, not to graze, not to pass through, to stand, to be seen. He turned slowly and walked back toward the house. "Get the camera," he called out. "Get Mitchell. Get everyone." Because they weren't hiding anymore, and in that still Wyoming dusk, the herd stayed where they were, framed by fading sunlight and the rising promise of battle. Not just to survive, but to be heard, to be counted, to be understood. And in that moment, as the sky turned to fire above them and the land fell into shadow, Thomas Redwater realized something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in years. They weren't alone anymore, and they were done running. The next 24 hours unfolded like a rising drumbeat, steady at first, then faster, louder, until every soul in Pinecrest could feel it echoing in their bones. It wasn't just the whisper of conflict anymore. It was a full-blown reckoning. The valley was waking up, not just the people, but the land itself. The mountains loomed taller, the wind carried a deeper chill, and even the birds flew differently, like they sensed something in the air that couldn't be ignored. At the heart of it all, the wild Mustangs stood resolute at the eastern edge of the Blackwood Ranch, and with them stood the question no one could answer yet. What are we willing to risk for what's right? In the early morning light, Thomas paced along the inside of the fence line, checking every post, every tension wire, every weak spot. He didn't expect to hold off helicopters with wooden rails and rusted nails, but it wasn't about holding them off. It was about making a stand, one the BLM couldn't ignore, one Harrington couldn't buy his way around. The Mustangs had chosen to come here, and Thomas, for all the ghosts in his closet, couldn't bring himself to abandon them. Not again. Joshua was already up, sitting cross-legged in the frost-hardened grass just a few yards from the fence. He wasn't playing. He wasn't talking. He was just present, silent, watchful. His eyes never left Star, who stood farther out in the pasture like a statue of something ancient and eternal. The boy hadn't said much since the herd had returned the night before, but he didn't need to. His quiet spoke volumes. He knew this wasn't over. He knew somehow that it was about to begin. Back at the house, Margaret coordinated efforts like a general in the thick of battle. Coffee brewed constantly. Phones rang without pause. Her table was covered in topographic maps, county records, USDA reports, and scribbled notes. Dr. Mitchell's temporary lab had been transformed into a coordination center. The DNA samples had been overnighted to a facility in Bozeman with a priority tag and a personal favor from a university contact who owed her for saving a prize stallion 5 years back. It wasn't guaranteed, but it was hope, and hope had become their most valuable resource. Jack and the frontier outlaws turned their focus to securing the perimeter. With rope lines, improvised barriers, and posted signs that read, "Private Sanctuary, No Trespassing," they made it clear to anyone watching that this wasn't just open land anymore. It was claimed. It was guarded. By the time the sun was fully over the ridge, 2 more vehicles had arrived. Locals who had heard the stories and wanted to help. One brought fencing wire. The other, a thermos of coffee and a cardboard sign that read in thick black marker, "We stand with the Mustangs." And the press? They came too. First it was just Riley Carter, the ever-curious reporter from the Pinecrest Herald. But by midday, a van from Casper rolled in, then a local news crew from Cheyenne, and then a blog photographer from Missoula who had caught wind of the story on social media. The power of the internet had taken hold. What was once a boy, a ranch, and a few wild horses had become something else entirely. A symbol, a flashpoint, a resistance. Sheriff Holden showed up just after noon, not in uniform, no lights, no backup, just his old truck and a face carved with lines deeper than yesterday. He stood on the porch with Margaret, arms folded, watching the herd from a distance. "I've been in law enforcement 30 years, he said finally. "Seen more than most, but I ain't never seen wild horses act like this." "They're not just acting," Margaret said. "They're choosing." Holden let out a long breath. his jaw tightening. "You know Harrington's not backing down. He's got more lawyers than the rest of the county combined. Hell, I'd bet he's already drafted an injunction." "He can draft whatever he wants," Thomas said as he stepped up beside them. "We're not trespassing. We're not obstructing a gather. We're standing on private land, protecting a herd that's come to us." Holden nodded slowly, eyes drifting toward the Mustangs. "And the boy? You still think he's just lucky?" "No," Thomas admitted. "Not anymore." That night, the temperature dropped fast. The stars came out in clusters so thick and bright, it felt like you could reach out and brush your fingers across them. A small fire burned in a metal barrel near the barn, and around it people took shifts, some with coffee, some with blankets, all watching the fence line like sentries on the edge of a forgotten war. Joshua fell asleep on a bench by the window, his small hand still clutching the drawing he'd made that morning. It was a rough sketch, just a pencil and paper thing, but it showed the ranch, the Mustangs, and a long line of people standing between them and something dark approaching from the hills. He didn't need words to explain it. Everyone understood. And out in the pasture, the herd slept too, fitfully, some standing, others lying in the tall grass. Star remained alert. His eyes didn't close, not for long, not with the rotors coming soon, not with the fight just hours away. In the darkness, Thomas stood again at the edge of the fence. His breath curled into mist, and beside him, Margaret stepped close. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Their shared silence said everything about grief, about resistance, about the strange ways the past comes back when you least expect it. "We might not win this," Thomas said quietly. "No," Margaret replied, "but we won't lose quietly." And as the wind swept down from the mesa once more, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the coming storm, Thomas knew one thing with absolute certainty. Tomorrow the world would be watching, and the wild would rise. The sun crested the hills with a chill in the air, but its light came golden and unflinching, as if nature itself had decided this was the day things would change. There was a peculiar stillness blanketing the Blackwood Ranch that morning. Not the peaceful kind, not the silence of calm, but a coiled tension, like the pause between thunderclaps, or the breath before a punch is thrown. The wild Mustangs stood at the eastern fence, their coats dusted with frost, unmoving as statues. Star stood at their front, neck arched, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew, somehow, he knew today was the line, and he would not let it break. Inside the house, Joshua was already awake. He hadn't slept much. Every creak in the floorboards, every distant sound outside, he heard it all. But the boy didn't complain. He didn't even speak until he had his boots on, jacket zipped, and his little hands curled into fists at his sides. He walked straight to the front porch, where Thomas sat nursing a mug of black coffee, and slid onto the wooden step beside him. Neither spoke for a long while. Then Joshua asked quietly, "Will Star be safe?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He didn't want to lie, but he didn't want to fill the boy's heart with dread either. So he said what he believed, even if it felt uncertain in the bones. "We'll do everything we can to make sure he is." The road leading up to the ranch kicked up dust by mid-morning. Not from friendly pickups or curious townsfolk this time, but from unmarked white trucks and low-slung trailers, rolling in with precision. The kind of precision that meant orders had been given. The kind that meant someone in a suit was watching this like a chessboard. Harrington had made his move, and he had sent the enforcers to take what he couldn't charm or buy. 2 black helicopters appeared not long after, low, fast, sweeping in from the west with the thump of rotors pounding through the valley like war drums. Every head at the ranch turned. The bikers froze mid-hammer swing. Margaret came out of the house, jaw clenched tight. Dr. Mitchell rushed from her mobile lab, holding her notes, her samples, her statements from respected scientists who had now gone public. Riley Carter already had her phone out, live-streaming what she could. The world was watching. A crowd had gathered now. Some ranchers who had changed their minds, people who'd read about the story online, others who just felt something bigger than themselves pulling them out to the fence line. They came with folding chairs, signs, flasks of coffee, and hard questions. This wasn't just about horses anymore, it was about something primal, something rooted deep in the soul of the land itself, the old Wyoming, the one where the horizon meant freedom, not profit. The helicopters slowed as they reached the airspace above the ranch. They hovered low enough for the downwash to scatter dust across the fields. Star reared, not out of fear, but out of challenge. His herd bristled behind him. Thomas stepped toward the fence, arms raised, signaling the pilots in a slow, deliberate motion. Land elsewhere. Not here. This land is protected. This herd is not alone. But the choppers didn't retreat. Instead, they veered north toward the access road that skirted the ridge behind Thomas's old sanctuary. And then came the ground crew, BLM agents, or so their jackets claimed, stepping out with tranquilizer guns and portable corrals. At their center stood Frank Miller, jaw clenched, clipboard in hand, flanked by men in Harrington's corporate uniforms. They didn't look like field officers. They looked like lawyers in denim. Thomas crossed the field to meet them, Jack Reeves at his side, Margaret just behind. Joshua stayed near the fence, fingers gripping the rails. Star hadn't moved an inch. "You've got no authority here," Thomas said, his voice steady, low, but carrying the weight of something immovable. Miller glanced at his paperwork. "We're authorized to retrieve federally managed livestock for population control and grazing protection. These horses," Margaret cut in, "came here voluntarily. Onto private property. They are not being corralled. They are not being fed or trained or touched. You have no jurisdiction unless you cross that line, and you better believe we've got every inch of this ranch marked and documented." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, holding up her report. "And we have DNA samples, Spanish Mustang bloodlines, clean and traceable, enough to file for federal heritage protection. We've submitted the paperwork. Your gather is now under review." Riley stepped closer, pointing her camera square at Miller's face. "And the live stream's already been viewed by over 20,000 people in the last hour. This isn't a quiet roundup anymore, Mr. Miller. It's a headline." For a moment, no one moved. Just the whine of the helicopters in the distance, the rustle of wind through the sagebrush, and the slow tick of tension building like thunder about to crack the sky. Then one of Harrington's men leaned in and whispered something to Miller. Whatever it was made his jaw go tighter, his hands curl slightly at his sides. "We'll be filing an injunction," he said coldly, then turned on his heel and walked back to the trucks. The helicopters turned westward, banking hard and pulling away. The sound faded slowly, replaced by the noise of collective breath returning to lungs across the ranch. Jack exhaled hard, looking at Thomas. "Well, I'll be damned. We held them." "For now," Thomas said. But the victory was real. The crowd erupted in cheers, small, disbelieving, but loud enough to echo across the hills. Margaret wiped her hands on her jeans, staring at the place where the agents had stood, disbelief still painting her face. Riley turned her camera back to Joshua, who now stood in front of the fence, his hand extended. Star stepped forward, closing the gap between them, and gently pressed his muzzle to the boy's palm, as if to say, "I knew you'd protect us." Later that night, with the headlines reading, "Wyoming Boy and Wild Mustangs Force Pause on Controversial Gather," and "DNA Testing May Save Historic Herd," Thomas sat once again on the porch, Joshua curled up asleep beside him. The moon was high, the stars bright, and in the field beyond, the Mustangs grazed in peace. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow. The legal fight wasn't over. Harrington would come back. The pressure would mount. But something fundamental had changed, not just in the land, not just in the town, but in himself. The past had knocked on his door, and for the first time in decades, Thomas Redwater had opened it. Inside that house was a family, outside it was a herd, and somehow, impossibly, a little boy had bridged the gap between the two, and that was something worth fighting for.